Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. As chair of RUSI, it's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. It's an important week on the illegal wildlife trade. As you know, in London, the Illegal Wildlife Conference is taking place here in London over the next 2 days. And later this afternoon, some of us will be involved in launching the United for Wildlife Financial Task Force, to which RUSI has extensively contributed. This event is entitled Wildlife Trafficking-Security Nexus, Targeting the Organised Crime Threat, and is hosted by RUSI under its Strategic Hub for Organised Crime Research in partnership with the Wildlife Conservation Society. I'm going to introduce the panelists in a moment, but first of all, let me give you some background to this event. We're all familiar with that the illegal wildlife trade and dealing with it is a moral imperative. And we're also familiar that the obligations established around the world under CITES are a legal imperative. But it's important for people to understand that this is not just an environmental issue, it's a serious and organized crime issue as well on a transnational scale. Organized criminal wildlife trafficking has a range of security issues, raises those issues across the supply chain, from source countries to transit countries, consumer countries. So as the conference gathers in London this week, it's important to address the security dimensions of this pressing issue. And in doing so, we're building on work that has taken place here at RUSI in the past, including the 2017 occasional paper that was entitled Poaching, Wildlife Trafficking and Security in Africa, Myths and Realities. The work that continues at RUSI around the financial dimensions of this organized criminal activity, which Cathy will shortly speak about, and the work we've done recently with the OECD on corruption as a facilitator of wildlife trafficking. And this and the work by a range of other organizations, including the WCS on the security dimensions of the illegal wildlife trade, is of critical importance. There's a lot more to do because there is limited information at the moment for many policy makers. And so at this event, we're going to cover a number of key topics, including the current evidence on organized crime and its connection to wildlife trafficking and the security threat posed, on the effectiveness of cross-sector collaboration and existing responses to this, on practical measures, including the use of financial tools to more effectively disrupt organized crime. And we're going to discuss what the key knowledge and capacity gaps are in addressing these issues. Now, we're lucky to have a selection of considerable experts here to discuss these issues. They're from a range of backgrounds, as well as academic backgrounds. Many have direct operational experience to bring to bear on this. I'm going to ask them each to speak in a moment for up to 5 minutes. Because there are a lot of issues here. The trouble is they're such experts, it's difficult to speak for 5 minutes, of course, because they have a lot to say. But if they can do that, I will also ask 1 or 2 people to respond from the hall, and then there will be time for questions. We have a hard stop at 2:40, at least that's when I have to leave this room, so I regard it as a hard stop. I'm sure everyone else can keep having discussions afterwards if you need to do so. In the event of an emergency, RUSI staff will guide you to the nearest emergency exit. And note that this event is under what we call the RUSI rule. Presentations are on the record, Q&A is off the record. So that allows us to move on to our panel. Cathy Haenlein, Dr. Paul Elkan, Vincent Opyene, Simon Marsh, Gloria Freund, and then I'm going to ask Dr. Tim Wittig to lead the response from the floor, as it were. So I'll just introduce that their biogs are posted outside, but first of all to introduce Cathy. She is a senior research fellow at RUSI, dealing with national security and resilience studies. She leads the research on serious and organized crime. She's chair of RUSI's Strategic Hub for Organized Crime Research. So, Cathy, you get the discussion going.
Sure. Thanks, and hi everyone. Yep, Cathy, Haenlein, Senior Research Fellow here at RUSI. Thank you all very much for coming to this event, which we've organised in partnership with the Wildlife Conservation Society. We're holding this event as part of our work at RUSI on an initiative called the Strategic Hub for Organised Crime Research, and I just want to say a few words about that for those who may not be familiar. Basically, the goal of the Strategic Hub is to develop a world-class research agenda that meets the needs of policymakers and practitioners in the field. And in doing this, the Hub aims to bring together academics, policymakers, and practitioners to create a network of experts who are working together to improve our response to organised crime. We're doing this because we're aware that both academics and policymakers have increased their focus on organised crime, but policy development and academic research have often nonetheless continued down different tracks. We think that there's a lot to be gained from facilitating a dialogue between the two, and it's exactly that we're hoping to achieve here today, specifically in relation to wildlife trafficking. So our focus today is on the organised crime dynamics underpinning transnational wildlife trafficking, and this is obviously part of a broader conversation about the wildlife crime security nexus. So to drive this conversation, we've brought together experts here with extensive real-world experience in tackling the security aspects of this threat. I know Paul's going to talk about some of the ground-level landscape manifestations of this threat, and then Simon, Gloria, and Vincent are going to go into a bit more detail with some case studies from higher up the trafficking chain. I know that many of the comments they're going to make are going to touch upon the financial aspects of this crime type. So I want to just use my very brief few minutes here to really frame this discussion on the financial side of things before they go into more details. So first, we have to establish why the financial angle is important when we're talking about wildlife trafficking. And this is obviously because wildlife trafficking is fundamentally about the money, the proceeds, and the profits. So across the supply chain, for every animal that's trafficked, there's money that's changing hands behind the scenes, and this can happen in cash, on online platforms, through mobile money, through trade, or through the formal financial system. But whichever medium it moves through, the hidden driver is the same. It's the pursuit of profit. So for the last 3 years, we at RUSI have been focusing very heavily on these money flows linked to wildlife trafficking. And we've been struck from the start, really, by just how little is being done to address these financial motivations, the financial drivers that traffickers are responding to. So how little is being done to follow the profits and the proceeds. And this is particularly striking when we consider the scale of this global illegal activity. I think everyone in the room is aware of the figures that we're talking about. So to address this at RUSI, we've been conducting research into the challenges and the opportunities available to use these kinds of financial investigation tools. And we've also been delivering training to law enforcement across East Africa on this topic. And we've been interested really in two things: in what is known about how the money's moving, and about what is being done and what capacity is in place to disrupt these money flows. So just very briefly on our findings, on a global scale, it's become very clear that financial tools are not being used systematically in relation to wildlife trafficking. And this is in contrast to many other organised crime types worldwide, where the use of these tools is by now very widely used. Instead, there's a tendency, instead of following the money, to simply follow the commodity and to stop at the seizure of that commodity without looking to use those financial footprints to move higher up the trafficking chain. And this is despite the fact that there are many of these financial footprints that are available to be followed. The operating model of traffickers itself requires them to make payments for a range of services, whether to rent properties or to pay for shipping facilities or to cover airfare, among many other things. At times, we've found that the barriers to the use of these kinds of tools lie in gaps in legislation. But in many other cases, it's clear that it's not the legislation that's the problem, it's implementation and awareness. And this is something that's come out very clearly from a study that was conducted last year by the UNODC. And that study found that of 44 countries surveyed worldwide, as many as 71% did not consider wildlife trafficking as a money laundering risk. So that's really a telling percentage. And just to add on to that, only 13% reported involving the National Financial Intelligence Unit in wildlife trafficking cases. So this is obviously a fairly bleak picture, but that's not to say that there's not some good work going on. There are a number of positive examples of the use of financial tools in response to this activity, and some of the other speakers are going to go into these examples, so I won't talk about that anymore. But just what I'll say to finish is that this is an approach that we feel can have very powerful results if expanded and used systematically. And in particular, we feel that there's huge potential to unlock financial intelligence linked to these issues by engaging with the private sector. So happy to talk more about this in the Q&A, and my colleague Tom Keating, who's director of the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies here at RUSI, is also here to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Cathy. That is a very clear introduction to this. We are following the commodity. We are not following the money at the moment. So let's go on to the other panelists. Dr. Paul Elkan, I'll call on next. He is a senior conservationist with the Wildlife Conservation Society. He's got extensive experience in Central and East Africa, and to a large extent in conflict zones. He's worked for over 28 years on these issues. So, Paul, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you, along with the other panelists. I work for WCS. I oversee our Sudano-Sahel regional program. However, also today I'm going to share with you some observations that were generated by a study commissioned by the EU in 2017 on the wildlife and security nexus in sub-Saharan Africa. And I'll be talking more about the context, the source areas, of course, into which feed the trafficking networks and the interplay between the source and the chain. We've seen over the past decade a major expansion, particularly in ivory trafficking in Africa, with the increase in the price of ivory and various inroads into Africa. The impact, of course, undermines the rule of law, affects the economies, puts local communities in physical danger, and creates a security threat, both locally, nationally, transboundary, and globally. In particular, in sub-Saharan Africa, the competition and conflict over land use and natural resources are exacerbated by weak governance, for the most part, organized crime and climate change. And this all plays out in and around protected areas and other natural resource zones in landscapes. So last year, the DevCo commissioned a study undertaken across sub-Saharan Africa, which generated an in-depth analysis of the interface between wildlife trafficking and security. It highlighted also the examples of what are people doing about the problem, what's working, what's not, are there lessons learned, are the means brought to the table adequate to address these problems, and then that generated a series of recommendations. The key questions that it focused on was, where does wildlife trafficking fuel or create conflict? Where does conflict fuel wildlife trafficking? What are the socioeconomic security impacts of wildlife trafficking, if any? How does wildlife trafficking undermine the rule of law? How does wildlife insecurity contribute to migration, human migrations? And then what approaches have been experimented with in different areas, and what is being done at the wildlife security nexus, which can serve as a basis for expansion. We have a slide just to give you an area, and I think it's good to focus on what we're talking about spatially. And we examined a range of areas and ecosystems all the way from the coasts of Kenya to the coast of Gabon, up into Burkina Faso, down to Miombo forests, more stable countries like Gabon versus less stable countries like Central African Republic. A team of 5 experts along with others and generated these analyses and produced 11 case studies in which security and wildlife factors were examined. So we also looked at secondary case studies, which are in yellow. The primary case studies are in red. And a 250-page report was generated, and hopefully it will be released in the near future by the EU. There's quite a lot of sensitive information which came out of it. Some of it's in the public domain, some of it not. I think just some key takeaways from the study are that, particularly with wildlife trafficking as a driver for conflicts and insecurity, that's actually not that common. but it does happen, particularly in the northern areas. You can think of the LRA and DRC. There's also the question of the Sudanese horsemen coming down through from Darfur into CAR, into Cameroon. That destabilizes. They're hunting for elephant ivory, and then that creates a security problem for local communities as well as the states involved. What's more common is when conflict, of course, generates perturbations, which then lead to wildlife trafficking. One element I'd like to touch on, though, is this question of terrorist groups' involvement or not in ivory trafficking. And there are some data points. We investigated different things. There's some out there in the media. Frankly, the evidence isn't that strong in many cases, but I think obviously there's some people know some things, other people don't know them. There's classified information on some of these issues, the question of Boko Haram and linkages with Mekebe or not in Gabon. I think the main takeaway point about terrorism is that natural resource bases, gold mines present an opportunity. Human trafficking presents an opportunity. Ivory trafficking presents an opportunity. Those resources need to be secured so that the groups can't tap into those financial flows. And so that makes a strong case for natural resource management as a prevention of potential security problems and risks. And that plays out spatially in these areas where you can see proximity of resources with different groups, not just terrorist groups, but other armed groups, which then use the natural resources to propagate their armed activities. And that's the second part is obviously many armed groups are using natural resources to fund their perpetuate their war efforts, whether it's bushmeat to fund their troops or whether it's individuals trafficking ivory or timber. And this has played out in various countries. And also, armed groups use the protected areas as safe havens, whether it's the Boni Forest in Kenya where the Al-Shabaab is, or the Sambisi Forest, or Garamba, or Imatong where you have different armed groups, or Boma Park. So that's well known. And so projecting governance into these areas from protected area management and anti-trafficking is critical. Transhumance pastoralism is a key part, crossing borders. And I think probably to get and wrap up on the key points, natural resource pillaging in governance vacuums perpetuates corruption. It provides an area which is easily exploited by sophisticated networks, as well as armed groups. And so the factor of corruption comes out again and again, and even in countries like Gabon, where you have some of the best, highest level engagement, you can find a corrupt system in the forestry sector, for example, which was recently declared, or a situation in Kenya, for example, with sandalwood, where, or ivory or rhino trafficking. I think one thing elements which came out, clearly there's some evidence for organized crime groups in East Africa shifting from human trafficking or drugs into ivory horn, and ivory and rhino horn at different times over the past decade. There's some clearly mixing of natural resources and corruption and racketeering happening. And one thing that comes out very, very strongly is the need for robust anti-corruption programs from top to bottom to really get at the root causes of this. I think that's the context at some of the key points coming out of this study. I think for this group, what clearly, another thing is, if the benefit of anti-trafficking and security, forward-leaning security management of protected areas such that we stabilize and secure zones and keep the resources where they need to be and out of the financial flows of armed groups and or traffickers or different crime networks, then that will stabilize. But we need to scale up the resources in order to get the job done and stay the course. We also need to have multi-donor programming, multi-tier programming over the long term in key areas which are unstable and will benefit from a combined security, conservation, anti-trafficking approach.
Thank you very much, Paul. A very clear message. We look forward to the report when it is published in due course. And you highlighted there the consequences for corruption, and our next speaker has a lot of experience fighting corruption as a state prosecutor with Uganda's Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. He's Vincent Opyene, the founder and chief executive officer now of the Natural Resource Conservation Network, an NGO working with the government of Uganda to investigate and prosecute wildlife crime and to fight corruption in law enforcement. So, Vincent, let's hear from you.
Thank you, sir. My name is Vincent Opyene. I work for Natural Resource Conservation Network as a Chief Executive Officer and founder of Natural Resource Conservation Network. NRCN is an NGO that was founded in Uganda after the CITES meeting in Bangkok, where Uganda was named among the gang of 8 countries notorious for illegal wildlife trade. So we said we are not going to be part of the gang, but we have to do something about it. And all we could do was to step out and come up with NRCN to fight illegal trade. So we do this by supporting Uganda Wildlife Authority through investigation of wildlife cases, and we are lances to privately prosecute wildlife cases in Uganda. So what I'm talking to you about today is about the actual field experiences of what we did exactly. It is not a research. What happened in our case is that working with other partners, we identified a criminal network. When we identified this particular criminal network, it was operating in Uganda, in Kenya, Tanzania, having part of the activities in South Sudan, Mozambique, and Zambia. But when you look at this network, they use Uganda as a collection point. They try to move wildlife products from all these different locations and have them stored in Uganda. And the key products that they are majorly interested in are ivory, pangolin scales, and rhino horns. And you could wonder why, of all places, they prefer to do it in Uganda. The reason why they prefer to do it in Uganda is because there's a low detection rate. Uganda Wildlife Authority is a big institution, we respect it, but it's good at dealing with poaching. It's not good at dealing with trafficking. Trafficking issues need a different set of skills. You don't have it, your place will be secure for traffickers. Another thing is weak legislations. Our neighbors from Kenya and Tanzania did a great job with their legislation, and they raised up the standards of the rates of convictions and the period you serve. Uganda still have an option of a fine or jail term. So these fellows are happy to do things in Uganda because they know at the end of the day, you will only get some small fine to pay, and you go home and continue doing business. Then another problem is the issue of corruption. They know that if I have some money in my pocket, I will pay and continue doing whatever I want to do. So when we got these members of the network, one key issue that we were interested in is looking at their financial operations. But we realized that this person is telling us is a dealer in second-hand clothes. But when you look at the accounts, the bank accounts of the dealer in second-hand clothes, it surprises us because this dealer have one account with about $150,000 US. So I think everybody in Uganda would say I would want to be a second-hand clothes dealer because, because there's money in it. But in the actual sense, when you see its level of involvement with second-hand clothes, it was so limited. Now, they prefer Uganda still because even if you are arrested, very few cases happens where people would go as far as following the money. We tend to stop at the level of prosecuting them, taking them to prison, and that is it. Nothing touches on their properties. They have their properties all over, and they continue doing business. Now, one thing that came out of this particular investigation is that when we try to look at their assets base, you realize that the wife of the suspect, who have never done any business, who have never worked in any public office, was able to buy a house worth $200,000 US. Now, if we kept wondering where this lady got the money to buy this kind of assets from. When we continued talking to this group and getting more information around them, one other thing that we realized is that they are saying things are going to change. We will no longer put any money in the bank. We will no longer use mobile money. But what we are going to do, we can easily move money across Africa, easily without anybody detecting. And when we move money across Africa without people detecting, we will go down and buy properties. The challenge that we have in Uganda as a country is that the property registry is not very organized. Not every property is registered. So transactions can take place without getting their way into the property registry. So with such transactions, these people will be happy and will be able to continue doing business and having money in their hands without anybody stopping them. So we need to think about the most appropriate way to deal with finances that are not in the banking system. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Very clear, again, very clear. And there are really, this is good. This is a very good panel. Every speaker has brought an important insight into this so far. So we're hoping this continues with no pressure on Simon Marsh, who is our next speaker. And he also has huge experience in law enforcement, like Vincent. In his case, the majority working on transnational organized crime. 14 years with the Metropolitan Police, and he joined the International Center for Asset Recovery. He's been based in Kenya since 2014. Huge experience of dealing with wildlife trafficking issues. Simon, it's you next.
Thank you. My job today is to tell a story. It's a true story, and it involves quite a few people in the room who played a part in that story. And the reason I tell the story is because it's an example of how NGOs, law enforcement, and public and private sector partnerships can work in a tangible scenario. So I'll try and get through it succinctly. Essentially what happened is, not that long ago, just last year, we in Kenya received from a partner, an NGO partner, some very valuable intelligence about some payments that went through the Hawala system from a gentleman, and I use the term loosely, in Uganda who had been arrested for trafficking ivory. Now, these Hawala payments were for large amounts in US dollars, and they were made to two individuals in Nairobi. So we did some checks on these individuals, and we very quickly ascertained that these individuals were not unknown for the trafficking of illegal wildlife commodities. So we decided, in collaboration with some Kenyan law enforcement partners, that it might be a prudent exercise to put these individuals under some sort of surveillance. And you'll understand I won't go into the particulars of that surveillance. However, one thing led to another during the next couple of weeks, and very quickly it became clear that we were looking at the right people. And 2 weeks later, colleagues from the Kenya Police Service executed a search warrant. And when they did that search warrant, which is in a suburb of Nairobi, they uncovered 216 kilos of unworked ivory. And they arrested 5 people who were present at the scene, 4 of whom worked in freight forwarding, and 1 of whom was a Kenyan Somali individual. A 6th individual was arrested a few days later who was trying to flee the country on forged papers. And so all of these guys were taken before court, and as per the Kenyan system, they took a plea, pleaded not guilty, and we decided to start a trial, as happens in Kenya sometime later. Now, normally in Kenya, that would be the end of the investigation. And the model we have been trying for some years to put across is that this is not the end of the investigation, this is the beginning of the investigation. And this is where the collaboration between the public sector, the private sector, and the task forces that are very much the focus of some of this week's conversations come into play. So going through what would be to most of us from law enforcement some basic steps, we looked at phones, we looked at emails, we looked at communications between parties, and we uncovered quite a lot of very interesting stuff, including a number of bank accounts. So we utilized the financial task force, and we asked them if they could look into some of these accounts. And should they find something that is of interest, then they make the appropriate recommendations via the appropriate legal channels. So what came out in the following days and weeks is that some of the entities and companies involved were moving tens of millions of pounds through these accounts. And they were doing so in companies that didn't actually have any physical presence. Shell companies, which many of us would know them as. And in many cases, these companies were operating in transnational import and export. And what better way to move commodities and money than having a large company that imports and exports, at least on paper. So the situation we find ourselves in now is we've identified people all over the world, in fact, who are involved in various different levels of the criminality, everything from financing to logistics to facilitating things going through the customs channels, the land borders, and moving globally around the world. And we have some very interesting high-profile public officials who find themselves potentially implicated in this. Hard to believe. I'm not saying it's the world's most perfect example, because we're a long way from that. However, what I'm saying is this example we're trying to put across with the task forces is that it can work. We can find a realistic scenario where we can work together. We can find mechanisms for sharing information. We can find legal mechanisms that allow us to work collaboratively within the frameworks that exist, and also through partnerships we can build in these sorts of forums. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. And I'll tell you why it's not perfect. Some of the guys we're looking at are powerful figures. And the reality on the ground from the parts of the world that I work in East Africa is that these people have the ability to influence either directly or through some sort of financial inducement to get themselves out of trouble. It happens very, very frequently, I'm afraid. And it's one of the frustrations that we face, and the word corruption has been mooted many times. And this is, without a shadow of a doubt, the major impediment to successful transnational investigations against high-level wildlife traffickers. There's no focus on following the money traditionally, and this is something that needs to change. We need to stop saying the seizure of commodity is the end of the investigation. We need to say the seizure of the commodity is the start of the investigation. We move too soon. And this is the one thing that I find very frustrating, and I know some of my law enforcement colleagues here would feel the same. We have the ability through our network and collaborative relationships here to be able to follow commodities a long way. We can do that through all sorts of methodology, which we don't need to elaborate on at this particular time, but the ability exists. And we can take things from country A potentially as far as country B, and we can take up both ends of the equation. So let's start to do that. And I think the last thing, which is a personal bugbear of mine, is we need to move away from training for the sake of training, conferences for the sake of conferences, this one excluded, and workshops for the sake of workshops. We need to put people on the ground who have the skills and the knowledge to put the theory into practice. Very shortly and sweetly, that's my point today.
Thank you. Also very clear. Excellent. This is a clear picture building up here. And our final introductory speaker from the panel has actually the longest experience of all of us in dealing with these things. Gloria Freund, she serves as the U.S. intelligence community lead for counter-wildlife trafficking. She brings more than 35 years of experience in national security in one way or another, first as a naval officer and then as an intelligence professional. So, Gloria, it's over to you.
Thank you. So we talked about commodities and having a commodity sort of eccentric approach to this. And we all in this room sort of recognize we have to sort of get beyond that and understand the smuggling and the sort of convergence of crime that actually is happening behind that. So my community undertook a study to take a close look at this convergence idea to try to understand, is this a real thing? We've heard lots of anecdotes about it, but it hasn't sort of gotten us over the speed bump of how we get other parts of our government engaged on this. So what my community did was basically identify a country where this problem exists in spades, and then against that country, work with departments who don't normally talk to one another, but work various pieces and aspects of this problem. So we went to an organization that works counter-threat issues, terror issues. We went to another organization that works proliferation issues. We went to another that works narcotics. And then finally we went to the wildlife sector and got a good data set about wildlife crime. So from each of these organizations that don't normally collaborate, don't normally talk, but were willing to share very granular data sets on the crime sector that they tracked on. And so what we did, it literally took 5 months to gather all this data into the same framework where we were able to digitize it and normalize it and get it so that you could compare like things. And combining these sectors to the idea of at least a virtual unity of effort, what did we find? We ended up and not knowing in advance whether there would be even one connection point between all of these data sets. Well, guess what we found? We found that convergence was absolutely bloody rampant through all of this, that in something like nearly 100 contact points just in the wildlife data, we found convergence of about 3/4 with the narcotics sector, for example. We found about a dozen contact points in the threat finance sector. We found other contact points in the counterproliferation sector. So these are all on the number one, right? They're right at the top of the national security priority list, right? So what that says is that the networks are moving everything. And we basically, by taking this very data-centric approach, we're basically able to validate quantitatively and qualitatively that this thing exists using data sets that really, and with a very rigorous process that no one can argue with. It basically, for the sample place that we studied, it proved that this is out there in a way that really should start informing how we approach this in a more holistic fashion. Am I running out of time?
No.
Okay.
Go on,
so
another couple of minutes, if you want.
So no, yes. So what I want to say to this also is that of all the data sets that we looked at, the wildlife data set ended up literally being the hero of all this because wildlife trafficking occurs in the visible part of the spectrum. We can see it. We've got NGOs and academics and private industry out there gathering information about this and with the eyes to see it, where our national security apparatus doesn't have that. We've got partner countries not so eager to engage with us on terrorism or on narcotics, but they are very keen to engage with us on the trafficking front. And by what we have shown here in our little study is that you start pulling on that thread of wildlife trafficking, and it takes you to all this other malign stuff, right? It's an opportunity. It's a perfect storm of an opportunity, basically, to get us smarter about all of the things we're interested in, both on the wildlife front and all of those things that the national security community says they care about as well. So they get something out of this, and we get something out of this by some kind of unity of effort that allows us to bring this kind of information into the same framework so we can start to see what we have in terms of this network activity and operations.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for those remarks. I think, as I mentioned before, some very clear messages there, that we're not following the money, we're following the commodity, that where there is a vacuum, corruption, and many other things we don't want will move in, that there are ways of moving money into things other than across banks, but into properties. You have to follow more than the money. That it is possible to find ways of collaborating successfully on this, and that there is a nexus with many other things that we want to tackle. Now, I'm going to ask as a first responder to this Dr. Tim Wittig, who is a scholar practitioner. He's an author, he's an educator about illicit trafficking and finance. He's currently the Director of Analysis for the Transport Task Force of United for Wildlife, which I chair. And in the next couple of hours, we're going to launch the Finance Task Force, which I chair, and which he will also be the analyst for. So I'll ask him to comment on this and then open it up to questions. Tim, there's a microphone there.
Thank you. And thanks to the panel. So I've had the honor and real privilege of working with everybody on the stage. So I think there's some common themes I'd just like to highlight that I think are really interesting, both from a conservation perspective and a security perspective. So I think there's three. So one is convergence. So this is the term, the buzzword that's often used. So it means that wildlife trafficking really should be seen as a security issue. It really has a place at the table for within the security domain. And there's really powerful convergence of all types. So you heard what Gloria just said, but also with corruption and different types of organized crime, drugs, human trafficking. Paul made a very compelling, educating presentation about how wildlife trafficking is converging with other forms of organized environmental crime. So you're really seeing the devastating criminal, the organized criminal devastation of environments, of whole landscapes. And also with financial crime, right? But then I think you can reverse that too. So you can say there's not only convergence in the threat, but also in the response, so that you have the security sector. So you have law enforcement, core law enforcement, even military responses or security sector responses, intelligence, that are actually getting a lot of value from the wildlife trafficking response, right? So by looking at wildlife trafficking, they're uncovering other overlaps and other things that fit into their high priority things. And then also conservation is getting a lot of value too from learning from and adapting proven best practices that are well established in the security field to the wildlife space, right? And I think one of the really core themes of that is that, and I think you see this is one of the things that this panel is very good illustration of. All of that is done through legal mandated authorities, right? So this is not, there's no cowboy operations here. This is all done according to best professional ethics, absolutely legal authorities, and things like that. So this reverse convergence almost or convergence in response is also really important. And then the third thing, I think, to kind of sum it up, I think what we're getting towards with this panel is, and I think other things that are going on at this week also, is first the necessity of collective action, right? So that we need to obviously work together. So I mean that's a nice thing to say, but these are all examples of how it actually can work in practice, and it is working in practice. And then also on the information and analysis side is that building up some kind of shared consciousness of the threat of wildlife trafficking, how it fits into bigger pictures, how it fits into existing established institutional responses. So I think this is often maybe a depressing issue to work on, but I think this panel shows that actually success really is possible and it is happening. So we can continue to do that. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And and I should add that what we're doing this afternoon is launching the Finance Task Force of United for Wildlife, where more than 20 global banks and financial institutions will sign a declaration at the Mansion House in the City of London in the presence of His Royal Highness the Duke of Cambridge, committing themselves to basically to follow the money, to build on anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing schemes, to also raise the awareness of their staff, and to work out new solutions to track what is going on in wildlife trafficking through the financial world, not just following the commodity. So I hope what we will do this afternoon will be an important step in starting to deal with some of these issues. So who would like to come in next? Who has a question for the panel? Yes, lady there.